pissed-off pouting-face king's guard gave the last and final warning double. Whispers of rebellion echoed in the shadows of every alley. People spoke of a new world, a world where the monarchy's rule would no longer hold sway over them. But the king, King Alaric, was not one to bend to the will of the people. He was known for his iron-fisted rule and unwavering loyalty to tradition. And yet, the situation was becoming dangerous, even for someone as powerful as him. In the heart of the castle, the king's guard prepared for what might be the final clash. The guards, highly trained and loyal, had always been the kingdom's first line of defense. But these weren't ordinary times. Captain Elias of the king's guard stood in the courtyard, staring out toward the castle gates. His thoughts were heavy. He had spent years in service to the crown, leading his men with courage and discipline. But today, something felt different. The weight of the kingdom's unrest hung in the air as thick as the morning fog. He knew something was coming, something that would force his hand. The crowds outside the castle gates had grown larger by the day. What had once been small protests over taxes and unfair treatment had turned into open defiance. The people had begun to chant in the streets. Their voices grew louder with every passing hour, each day a new sign of their growing anger. The rebellion, if it could even be called that yet, was starting to take shape. Vera, the leader of the people, had become a symbol of hope for the common folk. She was fierce, outspoken, and unyielding in her desire to see the kingdom's power shift away from the royal family. But to the king's guard, she was nothing more than a threat, and it was Elias' job to stop her, no matter the cost. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the castle, Elias gathered his men in the courtyard. The tension in the air was palpable. The soldiers' armor clinked with every movement, their eyes sharp and alert. Elias stood before them, his voice calm but firm. He had trained these men for years, and he trusted them with his life. But tonight, they would face a challenge unlike any they had encountered before. "Tonight, we stand firm," Elias said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "The king has ordered us to issue one final warning. This rebellion ends now. We show mercy, but only for one last time. If they refuse to listen, we will do what is necessary." His men nodded, their faces hardening. They were ready. They had always been ready to fight for the crown, to protect the royal family at all costs. But Elias could see it in their eyes. A few of them were uneasy. The people they were about to face were not invaders. They were their own countrymen, their own families, friends, and neighbors. Elias had seen it before. The hardest battles were the ones fought against those who were once on the same side. Elias took a deep breath, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The sound of the crowd outside the gates reached his ears, louder now, more insistent. The rebels had gathered in front of the castle walls. They were shouting, calling for the king's downfall, demanding a new era. Vera's voice rose above the others, rallying the people with words of freedom, equality, and justice. But Elias knew that their cause, no matter how noble it might have seemed, was a threat to everything he had sworn to protect. The king's orders were clear. The rebellion must be quashed. No mercy, but Elias wasn't sure if he could follow those orders. Not when he had seen the faces of the people who now stood against the crown. They were tired. They were hungry. They were desperate. Despite his inner turmoil, Elias knew that he had a duty. He could not let his emotions cloud his judgment. The king was the law. The monarchy was the foundation of everything they had built, and if the king's power crumbled, so too would the kingdom itself. Elias had always believed in the strength of the monarchy, in its ability to unite the people. But what if the people no longer believed in it? What if the king's rule had become a cage instead of a shelter? As Elias and his men walked toward the gates, the sounds of the crowd grew louder, more aggressive. It wasn't just shouting anymore. It was chanting, the kind of chant that filled the air with a sense of impending doom. Elias could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had always known that the king's guard would face battles, but he never imagined they would be fighting their own people. When they reached the gates, Elias stepped forward, his voice strong and commanding. "This is the final warning," he shouted. "Disperse immediately or we will be forced to act." The crowd fell silent for a moment, but it didn't last long. A voice rang out from the front, cutting through the air. "You are the ones betraying us." It was Vera. She stepped forward, her face set in a determined scowl. "The king has no right to rule over us. We demand freedom." Elias' grip on his sword tightened. Vera's words were like a slap to his face. She was right in a way. The king's rule had become oppressive and the people were paying the price. But Elias couldn't let them tear the kingdom apart. He had pledged his life to protect the crown, and he would not break that vow now. "We are not your enemy," Elias called back, "but we will not allow violence to take root here. Leave now, and we will show mercy." "Stay and you will force us to act." Vera's eyes narrowed. She didn't back down. "Mercy? You call this mercy? Your king's oppression is what drives us to fight. You can no longer hide behind the walls of this castle. We will take what is ours." The words stung, and Elias could feel his resolve beginning to waver. For a brief moment, he thought about what might happen if they just let them go. If they allowed the rebellion to take its course, perhaps things could change. But then he remembered the king's command. There was no room for second-guessing now. Elias took one last look at the men behind him. They were waiting for him to make the call. With a deep breath, he raised his sword and pointed it toward the rebels. "This is your final warning," he said again, his voice cold and unyielding. "Leave or we will take action." But before the crowd could respond, a voice from the back of the group shouted, "We will never back down." And with that, the crowd surged forward, their chants growing louder. The battle was about to begin. The air was thick with tension as Elias and his men stood at the gates of the castle, facing the seething crowd of rebels. The chants grew louder, echoing off the stone walls of the royal fortress. It was as if the very ground beneath them trembled with the force of the people's anger. Elias could feel the pressure building in his chest, a knot of unease that he couldn't shake. He had led his men through countless battles, but this was different. This wasn't a fight for territory or riches. It was a fight for the very soul of the kingdom. Vera stood at the front of the crowd, her eyes burning with defiance. She had become the symbol of the rebellion, the voice of those who had been oppressed for so long. Elias could see it in her passion, her belief that she was fighting for something greater than herself. But Elias also saw the danger in it. Rebellion, no matter how noble its cause, often led to chaos, destruction, and suffering. He had seen it happen before in other kingdoms in other lands. The cycle of violence and bloodshed could never lead to true peace. The king had given his orders, one final warning. The choice was simple: disperse or face the consequences. But the reality of the situation was far from simple. Elias knew that this moment could change everything for the kingdom. If the rebellion grew too strong, if the people broke free of the king's rule, there would be no going back. The kingdom's unity would be shattered, and it might never recover. Elias stepped forward, raising his hand to signal his men to stand at attention. The guards were disciplined, their expressions unreadable behind their helmets. They had been trained for moments like this, moments of crisis, when the lines between right and wrong blurred and the weight of duty pressed down on their shoulders. But even the most loyal soldiers had their limits. Elias could see that some of them were beginning to question the orders they had been given. They had fought to protect the kingdom, to preserve the monarchy, but now they were being asked to fight their own people. The thought unsettled Elias, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for doubt now. Vera stepped forward, her voice rising above the noise of the crowd. "You stand with the king, but you know in your hearts that he is no longer the ruler this kingdom needs. He sits on a throne of lies and greed. He has forgotten the people who made this kingdom great, but we remember. We fight for a new future, for a kingdom where the voice of the people is heard." Her words hit hard, and Elias could feel a stir in the crowd. The rebels, emboldened by her fiery speech, surged forward. Elias knew the time for words was running out. The king had made it clear that this rebellion would not be allowed to spread. If the guard did not act decisively now, it could lead to an all-out war. "Enough!" Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the crowd. He raised his sword, the steel gleaming in the fading light. "This is the last warning. If you do not disperse immediately, we will be forced to take action. Do not mistake our mercy for weakness." But Vera did not back down. Her eyes met Elias, unwavering and filled with conviction. "Your king is a tyrant, Captain. You know it. We know it. It is time for a change." Elias' grip on his sword tightened, and for a moment he felt a pang of doubt. The king's rule had been long and prosperous, but over the years cracks had begun to show. The people were suffering, their cries going unheard in the halls of power. Elias had always believed in the monarchy, had always trusted that the king's decisions were for the greater good. But now, as he looked at the faces of the rebels, tired, hungry, desperate, he couldn't help but question everything he had fought for. "Captain," one of his men, Sergeant Kieran, called from behind, "we can't wait much longer. The crowd is growing restless. We need to act now before it's too late." Elias turned to face Kieran, his mind racing. The sergeant was right. The situation was spiraling out of control. He could already see the first signs of violence. The rebels were not just protesting now, they were ready to fight. Some of them had weapons in their hands, crude and dangerous. The guards were getting nervous. The longer they stood there without action, the greater the risk of a full-scale clash. "I know, Kieran," Elias muttered, his voice low, "but we need to make sure we're doing the right thing. We can't just follow orders blindly. There has to be a better way." Kieran gave him a sharp look. "The king has made his will clear. We follow orders. That's our duty." Elias' heart sank. He had spent his entire career believing in the honor of the guard, in the duty to protect the kingdom. But now that duty felt like a heavy burden, one that threatened to break him. He glanced back at the rebels. Their faces were full of resolve. They weren't going to back down. The king had been clear, there was no room for compromise. It was either the crown or the people. And Elias was caught in the middle. "Captain Elias," Vera's voice rang out again, "the people have had enough. You can stop this now. Stand with us." The words hit him like a blow. Was this what it had come to? Was he really going to stand against the people who had once believed in the same ideals as him? Elias had always prided himself on being a protector. He had always fought for what was just, what was right. But now, everything felt wrong. His mind raced. The king had been a good ruler once, but had time worn him down? Had the power of the throne corrupted him? Elias didn't know. All he knew was that the rebellion was real and it was growing. The people weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted, and no matter how much Elias wanted to protect the crown, he couldn't ignore the truth that was right in front of him. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The chants of the crowd grew louder, filling his ears. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and smoke. Elias' fingers brushed the hilt of his sword as his thoughts swirled in confusion. Could he truly stand with the king, knowing what the people were enduring? Could he fight against his own people, the ones who had once trusted the monarchy? Then, as if a switch had been flipped, Elias made his decision. "Move in," he shouted to his men, his voice hardening. "Show them that the king's guard will not be swayed." His command was met with immediate action. The guards drew their swords and began advancing toward the crowd. Elias took a step forward, his heart heavy. This was the moment. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. The clash was inevitable, and though his mind told him that it was the only choice, a small part of him wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. The crowd parted as the guards advanced, but the rebels didn't back down. They raised their weapons, ready for what was to come. The two sides were on a collision course, and there was no turning back now. But as Elias raised his sword to lead the charge, something unexpected happened. Vera stepped forward again, her voice rising above the roar of the crowd. "You don't have to do this, Elias," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You can still change the fate of this kingdom. All you have to do is stand with us." For a fleeting moment, Elias hesitated. Then the sound of a horn blasted through the air, signaling that the fight had begun. The sound of the horn echoed across the courtyard, signaling the start of the inevitable clash. Elias could hear the heavy boots of the guards marching in unison, their swords drawn and glinting in the dim light of the evening. The crowd, though still many, stood firm, determined not to back down. The tension was so thick it felt as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the first spark to set everything ablaze. Elias' heart raced in his chest. He had made the command, given the order. Now there was no turning back. He had stood at the front of the king's guard for so long, commanding respect from his men, ensuring the protection of the kingdom. But now, standing at the precipice of this battle, he felt the crushing weight of his decision pressing down on him. The faces of the rebels, filled with anger but also with hope, haunted him. In the distance, he could see Vera at the front of the crowd. Her stance was unyielding, her hands clenched into fists. She stood as a leader now, not just a protester. Her eyes locked with his for a brief moment, and Elias could see the fire burning there. There was no fear in her gaze, only the certainty of someone who believed they were on the right side of history. Elias swallowed hard. He had been a soldier his entire life, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle he was about to fight was not just against the rebels, but against everything he had ever stood for. For the first time in his life, he questioned what he had been fighting for. Was it loyalty to a king who no longer seemed to care for his people? Or was it loyalty to his oath, to the crown, and the very institution he had sworn to protect? The first blow came suddenly, a rock thrown from the crowd, crashing into the shield of one of the guards. It was followed by another, then another. Soon the air was filled with the sound of more rocks and wooden objects being hurled, as if the storm that had been brewing for months had finally broken free. Elias signaled to his men, "Form a line, protect the front." The guards moved quickly, positioning themselves between the rebels and the castle. They formed a solid wall, shields raised, swords ready. Elias' heart beat louder in his ears as he surveyed the scene. He knew that the first few moments of the battle would be crucial. It was then that the tide would either turn in their favor or it would spiral out of control. The rebels weren't going to give up without a fight. The first of them lunged toward the guards, wielding crude weapons, sticks, knives, and even broken pieces of metal. But the guards were disciplined, their training kicking in as they blocked the strikes with their shields and countered with swift, controlled movements. Elias stood at the center of it all, his sword held steady in his hand. He moved with precision, cutting through the air with practiced ease. Every strike was calculated, every movement deliberate. He wasn't just fighting to defend the king. He was fighting to keep the peace, to maintain the order that the kingdom had long depended on. But as the rebels pushed forward, their numbers swelling, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting against something much larger than just a group of angry citizens. He was fighting against the very pulse of the kingdom itself. The crowd of rebels seemed endless, their voices rising in a desperate chorus. Vera's voice stood out above the rest, calling for the people to rise, to claim what was rightfully theirs. Her words fueled the fire of rebellion. Elias could see the conviction in her eyes, hear the passion in her voice. It was clear she wasn't just leading a revolt, she was leading a movement, something that had the power to change everything. If she succeeded, everything Elias had known, the kingdom, the crown, the rule of the king, would be nothing more than a distant memory. Elias fought on, but every strike against the rebels felt like a strike against his own conscience. He had always believed in the monarchy, had always trusted that the king's decisions were for the good of the people. But now, standing on the battlefield, he began to wonder if the king had lost sight of the people he was meant to protect. The people who had once stood by him trusted him. Now they were fighting for their lives, their freedom. "Captain," Kieran shouted from behind him, "we need to move the line. The rebels are getting too close." Elias nodded, his mind racing. The line of guards was holding, but just barely. The rebels were getting more aggressive, their movements more coordinated. It was clear that they were not just fighting for a cause, they were fighting for survival. And Elias knew that if they didn't regain control soon, the situation would become a full-scale riot. "Form ranks," Elias commanded. "Hold the line." But as the guards shifted into position, Elias' attention was caught by a figure in the distance. It was Vera again, standing in the front of the crowd, shouting words of encouragement to her people. She was fearless, a beacon of hope for the rebels. She pushed forward, her hands raised, urging the people to follow her lead. Without thinking, Elias stepped forward, his sword raised high. He knew what he had to do. He had to make it clear that the king's guard was not going to back down. The rebellion had to end tonight. But just as Elias moved to engage, something unexpected happened. A loud shout pierced the air, a voice from the back of the crowd. "Enough!" Elias froze. The voice was strong, commanding. He recognized it instantly. It was Torin, one of his most trusted lieutenants, a man who had been by his side for years. But now something was different in Torin's voice. There was no longer the steady loyalty Elias had come to rely on. Instead, it was filled with anger, frustration. "What's happening?" Elias demanded, his voice urgent as he turned to Kieran. "Captain Torin, he's with the rebels," Kieran said, his voice low, filled with disbelief. Elias' heart sank. Torin had been one of the most loyal guardsmen in the king's guard. How could he have betrayed them like this? How could he have turned against everything they had fought for? As Torin made his way through the crowd, his face was grim, determined. He was no longer wearing the royal guard's armor, but instead wore the simple clothes of a rebel. His eyes met Elias' across the battlefield, and for a moment it seemed as if time had stopped. "Elias," Torin called, his voice carrying across the field. "This kingdom is broken. You know it as much as I do. The people are suffering, and no amount of fighting for the king will change that. The time for change is now." Elias' sword lowered slightly, his grip loosening as his mind struggled to keep up with the shock of the moment. Torin, his trusted comrade, had joined the rebels. And worse still, he was leading them, calling for the same change that Vera had demanded. Elias stood frozen, torn between duty and a growing realization that the kingdom he had pledged to protect might already be lost. Could he still fight for the king, knowing that this rebellion wasn't just born from anger, but from a genuine desire for a better future? Or was Torin right? Was the kingdom truly broken beyond repair? The battlefield felt like it was spinning out of control. Elias stood in the midst of it all, his sword still gripped tightly in his hand, but his heart felt heavy. The clash of metal, the shouts of anger, the cries for justice, they all seemed to blur together as the reality of the situation hit him like a wave. The kingdom, the crown, the oath he had sworn, all of it seemed so distant now, so unclear. Torin, once a trusted lieutenant of the king's guard, now stood among the rebels. His betrayal was a wound Elias hadn't expected, one that cut deeper than any physical strike. The rebel leader's words echoed in Elias' mind. "This kingdom is broken. The time for change is now." And as much as Elias wanted to reject them, part of him couldn't help but agree. The more he saw the people fight, saw the anger in their eyes, the more he realized that something in the kingdom had been broken for a long time. The king's rule, once strong and just, had become something unrecognizable. The people were no longer just protesting, they were fighting for their future, for their dignity. Elias shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts that swirled in his mind. He had a duty. He had to stop this rebellion, had to protect the king. But the sight of Torin, standing at the front of the rebel line, filled him with a sense of unease. The man had been loyal, so loyal, and now he was leading the charge against the very monarchy they had both sworn to protect. "You need to make a choice, Captain," Kieran's voice broke through Elia's thoughts. The sergeant stood beside him, his face grim. "The line is breaking. The rebels are pushing us back." Elias looked around. The king's guard was holding, but barely. The rebels were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble with the weight of the conflict. Every time Elias thought the tide might turn in their favor, the rebels found a way to push back harder. The king's orders rang in his ears: stop the rebellion, no matter the cost. But the longer he fought, the more he wondered if those orders were even just any more. Torin's voice rang out over the chaos, calling to the rebels, urging them forward. "The guards are weak. The king is weak. The future of the kingdom is ours." Elias' breath caught in his throat. The words stung, not just because they came from his former comrade, but because he knew there was truth in them. The king's strength had diminished over the years, replaced by greed and cruelty. The people had suffered, and now they had finally risen up. Could Elias, in good conscience, continue to fight for a king who had lost the trust of the people? "We need to push them back," Elias shouted, his voice firm. But even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure if he meant them. Was he really ready to crush the rebellion, to fight against a cause that was so clearly born from a desire for justice? Kieran gave him a sharp look, but there was hesitation in his eyes as well. "Captain," Kieran said, his voice quieter now, "are we doing the right thing?" Elias turned to face him, and for the first time he saw the doubt in his sergeant's eyes. Kieran had always been a loyal soldier, but now he was questioning everything they had fought for. The weight of the moment settled over Elias like a stone. He had always believed that loyalty to the crown was the highest duty. But loyalty to a broken system was not the same as loyalty to the people. Could he continue to serve the king when the very people they had sworn to protect were being crushed beneath the weight of the monarchy? As the battle raged on, Elias made his decision. The sight of Torin, rallying the rebels with fire in his eyes, was too much for him to ignore. He couldn't fight against the people anymore. He couldn't fight for a king who had turned his back on his own citizens. But he wasn't ready to turn his back on his men, not yet. "We're falling back," Elias said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "We're not going to fight this war for a king who's already lost his crown." Kieran looked at him, his eyes wide. "Captain, what are you saying?" "I'm saying we're done," Elias replied, his voice low but resolute. "The kingdom is broken, Kieran, and if we keep fighting for a king who's lost his way, we'll only be a part of the destruction." Kieran didn't speak immediately. He looked out at the battlefield, his eyes scanning the faces of the men around him, then turned back to Elias. Slowly, reluctantly, Kieran nodded. "Then we stand with you, Captain," he said quietly. Elias' heart surged with relief. It wasn't the decision he'd expected, but it was the one he needed. They couldn't fight for the king anymore, but they could fight for something better, something worth believing in. Together, Elias and Kieran turned away from the fight and made their way toward the rebels. They moved quickly, slipping through the chaos of the battle, keeping low and out of sight. The soldiers they passed gave them questioning looks, but Elias knew they wouldn't stop them. The king's guard was no longer their path to salvation. It was the people who were fighting for change. As they approached the front lines, Elias could see Vera again, still leading the charge, her face fierce with determination. And at her side was Torin, his eyes fixed on Elias. The moment stretched out as the two men faced each other across the battlefield, the distance between them filled with unspoken words and shattered loyalty. Torin's voice carried across the gap. "You came to join us, Elias. It's not too late. The people need you." Elias' heart ached. He wanted to answer, wanted to tell Torin that he had always believed in their cause, that he had always fought for justice. But words were no longer enough. Action was what mattered now. He was done fighting for a king who couldn't hear the cries of his people. It was time to stand with those who would rebuild the kingdom, not tear it apart. "I came to end this senseless fight," Elias said, his voice ringing with finality. "We'll fight together, Tauren. But not for the king. We fight for the future of the kingdom, for the people who still believe in what it can be." Tauren's eyes softened for a moment. There was a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or understanding, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Tauren nodded, and together they moved toward the heart of the rebellion, ready to stand against the monarchy and fight for a new world. The battle was far from over, but for Elias the choice had been made. The future of the kingdom would no longer be shaped by the old guard. It would be shaped by the will of the people. The kingdom was changing, but no one could say yet whether it was for better or for worse. The dust of battle had settled over the castle grounds, and though the fighting had ceased, the tension in the air still lingered like a storm waiting to break. Elias stood with the rebels now, not as an outsider but as one of them. The king's guard had been fractured, torn apart by the choice he had made, but the decision was done. There was no turning back. As he looked around at the faces of the people who had once been enemies, Elias realized that he had finally stepped away from the shadows of duty and into the light of something new. The rebellion, once a chaotic gathering of angry voices, was beginning to take shape. There was a purpose now, a vision for what the kingdom could be, a kingdom where the people's voices mattered, where the king no longer ruled with unchecked power. Vera stood beside him, her expression one of quiet determination. She was still the same fierce leader who had spoken out against the monarchy, but now there was a calmness in her, a sense of responsibility that came with knowing she was a part of something much larger than herself. Elias admired that about her. She had always been driven by the belief that change was necessary, but now she was beginning to understand the weight of leading a nation into that change. "We've done it," Vera said, her voice soft but filled with the weight of everything they had fought for. "We've taken the first step." Elias nodded, but his heart felt heavy. The battle was over, yes, but the true fight had just begun. The kingdom was in ruins. The rebellion had succeeded in toppling the king's guard, but now they had to rebuild. The people were eager, hungry for justice, but how would they create a kingdom that was truly free? How would they move from rebellion to unity, from anger to peace? "There's a long road ahead," Elias said, his voice quiet as he looked around the ruined courtyard. "The fighting is over, but the real challenge begins now. We have to decide what kind of kingdom we want to build." Vera met his gaze, her eyes full of the same uncertainty he felt. The people had fought for freedom, for equality, but those ideals could easily be lost in the chaos of trying to rebuild. Who would lead? Who would make the decisions that would guide the kingdom forward? The monarchy was gone, but the power vacuum left in its wake was just as dangerous. If they weren't careful, the rebellion could become something just as corrupt as what it had replaced. "We'll figure it out," Vera said, her voice firm once more. "The people will lead. This isn't just about one person. It's about all of us together." But even as she spoke those words, Elias could see the doubt flickering in her eyes. She knew, as he did, that the road to true freedom wasn't as simple as just overthrowing a king. It was about creating a society where power was shared, where no one person held all the influence, where everyone had a voice. And that was a far more difficult task than any battle they had fought. How could they ensure that the new kingdom wasn't just a different version of the old one? Before Elias could respond, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. He turned to see Tauren approaching, his face still serious, though there was a hint of something softer behind his eyes. Despite the betrayal, despite the path they had taken that had separated them, Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of relief at seeing him again. Tauren had been the one who had first challenged the king, the one who had seen the cracks in the monarchy before anyone else. Now, standing beside Vera, He looked like a man who had found his place in a new world. "We have to make a decision, Elias," Torin said, his voice steady but urgent. "The people are waiting. They want to know what happens next. We can't just let things fall apart." Elias nodded, taking a deep breath. The weight of the responsibility they now shared was immense. But he knew that it was something they couldn't ignore. The people had put their faith in the rebellion, in the idea of a better future. It was up to them, up to Elias, Vera, and Torin, to make sure that faith was not misplaced. "We need to bring the people together," Elias said. "We need a council, not just rebels and soldiers, but farmers, merchants, teachers, everyone who represents the heart of the kingdom. Only then can we begin to rebuild." Torin and Vera exchanged a look, and then Torin nodded. "A council. That's the only way we'll ensure that this isn't just another regime. We can't afford to let the power shift from one ruler to another. The people must decide." It was a plan, a first step toward creating a kingdom that was no longer ruled by one person, but by the collective will of its people. But as Elias looked at the faces of the rebels around him, some filled with hope, others with suspicion, he knew that convincing them of this new path would not be easy. They had fought for freedom, yes, but what did that freedom really mean? Was it the freedom to choose their own leaders, to build a new system? Or was it the freedom to take what they had fought for and claim it as their own? The road ahead was uncertain, but Elias felt a sense of determination grow within him. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something new, something that would take time and effort. They had to rebuild the kingdom from the ground up, but they had the power to do it. They had the chance to create something that would truly be for the people, by the people. The following days were filled with discussions, debates, and the slow process of rebuilding. The council began to take shape, a group of representatives from every part of the kingdom, farmers, craftsmen, scholars, and former rebels. They came together not as separate factions, but as a united front, each voice contributing to the creation of something better. But as Elias sat in the council meetings, listening to the voices around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the kingdom was still fragile, that the change they had fought for could easily slip through their fingers. It would take more than just words to ensure that the new kingdom stayed true to its promise. "We have to remember why we fought," Vera said one evening as they sat together after a long day of meetings. "This isn't about power, it's about justice, equality. It's about giving everyone a chance to have a voice." Elias nodded. The rebellion had been born from a need for change, but it couldn't be defined by the anger and the fighting that had brought them here. It had to be about the people, about ensuring that no one was ever again forced to fight for their right to be heard. The work was long, and the challenges were many. But for the first time in years, Elias felt like he was part of something greater than just the king's guard. He was part of a movement, a chance to create a kingdom where the people could truly live in freedom. The road ahead would be difficult, but Elias was no longer alone. He had the support of the people and the courage to see it through. Together they would rebuild the kingdom, not as subjects under a king's rule, but as citizens, each with a voice in the world they would create. And so, the battle for the future of the kingdom was won, not with swords but with the strength of the people's will. The road ahead would be long, but it was one Elias was ready to walk, because this time the kingdom truly belonged to the people.